NATO defense ministers have agreed to strengthen their deterrence capabilities to protect the airspace of member states.
A convoy of 400 trucks carrying food, medicine, and fuel was dispatched for Gaza from Egypt on Wednesday as Israel limits deliveries, citing Hamas truce violations. Syrian President Ahmad al-Shara made an unprecedented official visit to Russia less than a year after his rebel forces ousted Kremlin ally Bashar al-Assad.
NATO defense ministers have agreed to massively increase deterrence capabilities when it comes to drones and Russian jets that have been seen in NATO airspace in recent weeks. Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, made the point that if any of these jets or drones pose a threat to NATO territory, then they can be shot down. He was also asked about the issue of Tomahawk cruise missiles and whether or not he thought that Donald Trump, the US president, would agree for Ukraine to have access to these missiles and use them in Russian territory. He said, of course, this was Donald Trump's decision alone, that we'd hear about it on Friday at a meeting at the White House between President Zelensky and President Trump. But he said overall he was happy this conversation was taking place because ultimately it's about bringing Vladimir Putin to the negotiation table.
Sweden is readying for war. Since 2024, it has invested around 7.7 million euros to upgrade its 64,000 shelters built during the Second World War and the Cold War, like this one in Sweden's capital of Stockholm. Delgeldam's car park seems like an ordinary underground parking area carved into the rock face, but it can actually also serve as a public shelter for 1.2 thousand people.
It can resist the blast and the debris and such things that comes with a bomb. And then it's airtight, so it even resists biogas or chemical gas or even nuclear waste.
With tensions with Russia increasing since the full-scale war in Ukraine, the Swedish government has promised to increase its civil defense budget by 7 times. But Johansson says the money allocated is unlikely to cover the cost of fixing all of the shelters, let alone building new ones. Sweden's civil defense minister warned last year that a military attack could not be ruled out.
A convoy of 8 trucks drove through the Rafah border crossing from Egypt into Gaza on Wednesday, according to the Egyptian Red Crescent. The convoy of 400 trucks was carrying 5,700 tons of food, more than 1,400 tons of medical supplies and equipment, and around 2,500 tons of fuel. State-run Egyptian broadcasters showed footage of the convoy as it passed through the Egyptian side of the crossing. They were headed to an Israeli inspection area in the Kerem Shalom crossing before being allowed into the enclave. It's part of Phase 1 of the ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas, brokered by U.S. President Donald Trump. The deal stipulated that pre-war levels of 600 trucks a day were to be allowed into Gaza to replenish the struggling population with critical food and supplies. Israel said, however, that it would only permit 300 trucks daily, citing alleged Hamas violations of the deal. Earlier in the week, Israel threatened to keep Rafah shut and reduce aid supplies as it accused Hamas of releasing the bodies of deceased hostages too slowly. Humanitarian groups have called on Israel to immediately abide by the terms of the deal and allow the agreed-upon number of trucks to enter the strip.
The war in Gaza may be over, but thousands of people across Spain have taken part in a national strike called by major labor and student unions to protest what they describe as the genocide against Palestinians in Gaza. Protests were reported in major cities including Madrid, Barcelona, and Seville, where demonstrators carried Palestinian flags and banners calling for peace and justice.
Vamos a estar hasta el final en las calles hasta que este genocidio termine y sobre todo también para denunciar este plan de paz que nos están vendiendo como una gran solución y lo único que va a hacer es seguir trayendo más dolor y más genocidio hacia el pueblo palestino.
The strike comes just days after the announcement of the first phase of a peace plan between Israel and Hamas. Despite the diplomatic breakthrough, Organizers pressed ahead to demand an end to the violence in Gaza and the severing of ties with Israel. Spain's center-left coalition government has been one of the most outspoken in the EU against Israel's attacks on Gaza. Yet, support for Palestine has become an increasingly divisive national political issue.
It's an announcement that has sparked lots of debate here in France. The suspension of the pension reform, one of President Emmanuel Macron's most controversial policies, is expected, barring any surprises, to be formally approved by Parliament in November. And not everyone is happy about it.
Ça va coûter énormément à tous les Français dans les années à venir. C'est pas la bonne approche puisque c'est du marchandage électoral.
L'âge de départ doit être revu et certainement allongé. La vie s'allonge, donc l'âge de départ doit partir plus tard. Enfin, on doit partir plus tard. Maintenant, si ça calme les esprits et si ça permet d'avoir un budget, c'est une bonne chose. C'est habile. Je crois que c'est très habile.
The government is pausing the retirement age increase from 62 to 64 to avoid a no-confidence vote. But in Paris, protesters remain wary of this promise.
Ce n'est que partie remise, ce n'est pas une annulation pure et simple.
J'ai participé à quelques manifestations pour justement contre cette réforme. Donc forcément, ça va plutôt dans le bon sens si on prend simplement le résultat. Mais il y a une grosse méfiance et c'est surtout reporter le problème à plus tard, à 2027.
A reform that is being put on pause but not fully scrapped. It looks like pensions will remain at the heart of public debate in France for many years to come.
Syria's interim president, Ahmad al-Shara, met with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Moscow in an unprecedented official visit on Wednesday. The visit comes less than a year after al-Shara led a swift rebellion which dethroned Kremlin ally and longtime president Bashar al-Assad in December. He was greeted with full military honors upon his arrival, as the Kremlin looked to establish working ties with the country's new leadership. Putin said, however, that Russia's policy towards Syria remains constant, claiming that it's rooted in the same driving principle as it always was.
В России никогда в отношении Сирии не было никаких каких-то отношений, связанных с нашей политической конъюнктурой или с особыми интересами. Мы всегда руководствовались на протяжении всех этих десятилетий одним – интересами сирийского народа.
Speaking to reporters, al-Shara noted that his country shares a deep and historic link with Moscow. The Syrian leader said much of the infrastructure was built by and is maintained by Russians. Former President al-Assad currently resides in Russia, his home since fleeing Syria when rebel forces entered the capital Damascus. al-Shara is expected to seek al-Assad's extradition to face a trial back home for war crimes committed in Syria's 14-year civil war. In an interview with U.S. media earlier this week, he said that his government will use all available legal means to hold the ousted president to account. The Kremlin has so far avoided the topic. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen continued her multi-state tour of the Western Balkans on Wednesday as she visited Kosovo and met with its leadership. The visit followed an earlier stop in Belgrade where the Commission chief met with Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić, urging him to make concrete his country's commitment to EU accession. In Pristina, the Kosovar capital, von der Leyen met with President Vjosa Osmani as she looked to advance the bloc's enlargement program in the region before moving on to North Macedonia. President Osmani reaffirmed Kosovo's commitment to EU membership and underlined the vast reforms being made to democratic practices and rule of law indexes. Von der Leyen also met with acting Kosovar Prime Minister Albin Kurti.
O čemu su tačno razgovarali još uvek nije poznato jer konferencije za medije nije bilo, ali je zanimljivo da se Ursula von der Leyen sastala sa Albinom Kurtijem u prostorijama Skupštine Kosova, a ne u prostorijama vlade. Ono što je poznato jeste da je stav Evropske unije da se ni jedan evropski zvaničnik neće sresti ni sa jednim zvaničnikom kosovske vlade sve dok vlada ne bude u punom mandatu. Za Euronews iz Prištine, Anđelka Ćup.
During our R&D process, we have made 200 of this and conducted more than 5,000 safety testing flights in extreme heat, high altitude, extreme cold, moisture areas, so it actually can handle all the situations.
المجال الجوي نحن نتخيله نتخيله مثل الشوارع اليوم. لازم نسوي له نفس الشوارع ونسوي مثلا حق كل طياره مسار وحق كل مشروع مسار خاص فيه عشان ننظم هاي العمليات هاي، لان اليوم كل العمليات اليوم تتنظم اصلا اوريدي موجوده عندنا تطبيقات تنظم العمليات هاي. كل العمليات اليوم في دبي نحن نراقبها عن طريق التطبيقات اللي عندنا موجوده في هيئه دبي للطيران المدني، والتوجيهات اللي عندنا اللي موجوده طبعا مع المستندات.